Hey everyone, today on the plastic canvas we're painting the witch from Oathsworn by Shadowborne Games. And yep, that's the best I could do with the box. It is huge. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to the first video in this new series. We're kicking off Oathsworn by painting the witch. She's one of the characters that you can play as in this boss battler adventure game by Shadowborne Games. So I've been really looking forward to getting onto Oathsworn for a while now because it has some really cool looking minis with some interesting and dynamic poses. But I chose to start with the witch because I haven't painted a mini for a while now that's given me a chance to do some OSL. But with that lantern, I'll be able to paint it casting light onto her staff. But as always, I'm starting off by painting her skin. And what I've started doing lately is using brown as a base coat and then gradually mixing tan skin into each layer as I'm highlighting. The reason I've started doing this is because the brown base coat adds a lot more depth to the skin tone than what you get from just using a wash like Ryclone Flesh Shade. But because I have them base coated with either red or grey, it doesn't shift the skin tone to either warm or cool, it just keeps it neutral. So at the moment I'm doing the first layer of the highlighting, and this would be roughly a 70-30 mix of earth brown and tan skin, where most of it is earth brown. But now that I've gone back to her face, I'm starting the second layer, and this is now mostly tan skin. For the first layer I covered everywhere except for the areas I wanted to be in shadow. So I painted her full brow, cheekbone, nose, top lip, those sorts of areas. But for this layer, I'm repainting those same parts, but reducing the amount of area. So with her cheekbone here, I'm more focusing on the upper facing portion of it, so that the previous layer can still be seen before blending into the shadows. And now for the final layer of highlighting, I've gone to straight tan skin, and this is just for where the most amount of light will be hitting. So just above her eye where her brow sticks out the most, the tip of her nose, and the very tip of her cheekbone, those sorts of areas. And as this layer is being done, you can see how much contrast you get between these final highlights and the shadows. And that's what you get from using the brown as a base coat. And now we're getting onto what has become my favourite part of a mini to paint, and that's leather. I don't really know why I enjoy painting it so much. I think for a start it's probably the material that I paint the best, certainly better than metal or something like that. But I think really it's the freedom, I guess, that you have while painting it, because there's no precise way to paint it. As leather ages and is exposed to the elements, it fades in different ways and takes on other colours like reds and greens and also becomes cracked. So there's a lot that you can do with it. But for the witch's pants, I'm not going for anything out of the ordinary, just a good old set of leather pants. So I started by base coating with a mix of black and ruddy leather. That's to create really dark shadows so that by the time I finished highlighting, there's going to be a really strong contrast. This contrast is what's going to emphasise the fading of the leather and how much adventuring the witch has done. You can see now that I've gone onto the highlighting, and I've started by using straight ruddy leather. Now you can see that I'm painting in lots of short, sharp strokes rather than just smoothly covering an area. That's because I want to create the look of texture and that her pants have become scratched and scuffed over time. It's really important with that first layer that enough of the base coat is left showing, as that's what's going to create the contrast at the end. And now we're getting straight into the second layer, and I've mixed in some leather brown to lighten it off. I'm going to be covering the exact same areas and still using mostly short, sharp strokes, but I'll be reducing the amount of area I cover towards where I want the leather to end up looking its most faded and scuffed. And then from here, each layer will just have more and more leather brown mixed in until I'm painting with just straight leather brown. That last layer will cover the smallest amount of area and will just go where I want her pants to look their most faded. So now I'm just moving on to the other leather straps and pouches that are attached to her pants. I still want these to look like leather, but I don't want them to blend too much into her pants, so I'm going to differentiate them a bit. So I'm base coating with polished leather, which almost looks like it has some orange in it. Then with skeleton bone, I'm going to paint lots of small lines and dots over the areas to start to create scratch and scuff marks. Then over that, I'll put sepia and red washes to dull it all down. I'll repeat that a couple of times, which will make the scratch and scuff marks look like they've happened over time, but will also make the straps and pouches stand out from her pants. One important thing when doing this technique is that each time you repaint the lines and dots, you don't cover up all of the ones from the last layer. The idea is that by having the lines and dots covered by different amounts of washes, some scratch and scuff marks will look more recent than others. Now I'm just starting to do a really simple job on the metal knee and boot pads. I'm just starting with a mix of blue, black and silver metallic so that I have a dark base to work with. A black wash will then go over this to dull it all down. Then I'll paint over that with the same mix as the base coat, but without the black so that it's lighter. But I'll focus that layer more on the edges to start to make the armour look banged up. Then I finish with straight silver metallic right on the edges to make them look the most damaged. I'm just doing this really simply because I want her pants and robe to be the focus. This is just there to show that they're metal. So the next few parts are just some smaller details that I'm not really going to talk through. You'll just be able to see what I'm doing. So it'll be the belt buckle which I'm painting now, the grey shirt that she's wearing under the corset, the purple corset itself, her hair, and then the sleeves that come out from under her robe. Those sleeves I end up painting just in the exact same way as her pants. Alright, so now we're getting onto her robe, which is her main feature. I spent a fair chunk of the time on just her robe to try to really make it stand out. In her artwork, her robe isn't a vibrant red, and I wanted to stay consistent with that. What that meant was that to be able to get contrast between the shadows and highlights, I needed to start dark so that I didn't have to go too light. So I base coated with clotted red, but when it dried I wasn't happy with how dark it was. So you can see that I've changed to bloodstained red. This is my darkest red, and I'm re-base coating with it. This definitely ended up being a good idea because it dried much darker. So now that the bloodstained red base coat has dried, I've now gone back to clotted red for the first layer of highlighting. This layer is going to cover most of the base coat, except for where I want the shadows to be their darkest, which is pretty much right underneath each of the folds. This is where good quality minis are so good to paint because you've got really well defined details. So basically, all I'm doing is starting where I want the highlights to end up being the lightest, and then working towards the shadows. Then when I get to the edge of where I want the shadows to be, I stop. And now you can see that I'm blending out the edge. So I'm cleaning the paint off the bristles, leaving them a bit damp, and then feathering out the edge so that it blends smoothly into the base coat. And I'll just keep doing this as I work my way around her robe. Alright, so now that the first layer of highlighting is dried, we're moving on to the next. For this layer, I'm sticking with clotted red, but I've added in some heraldic red. This is a more saturated red so that it's going to build some contrast, but it's not over the top because, like I said earlier, the robe in her artwork isn't too vibrant. A good thing to keep in mind is that as the paint dries, it darkens. So even though this red looks pretty intense at the moment, it won't stay that way. But the way I'm painting this layer is exactly the same as the last. I'm starting where I want the highlights to end up being their brightest and then painting towards the shadows. But this time, I stopped further short of them than what I did with that last layer. That's so that you can see some of every layer, and that's what will help us to have nice smooth blends. But just like the last layer, I'm feathering out the edge by cleaning the bristles and leaving them a little damp. Not too much to add for this layer. I've now gone to straight heraldic red and I'm painting it in the exact same way as the last few layers, but this will stop even further short of the shadows. After this layer, I do one final layer with a little bit of orange mixed in, just for a final boost to the contrast, but it covers a very small amount of area so that the overall look of the robe doesn't get too intense. Alright, so now we're starting to work on the staff. The way that I typically paint wood, which is exactly what I'll do here, is to paint the grain in gradually lighter and lighter browns by mixing in more and more bone colour. Then I put a sepia wash over the top to tint the grain a nice wood colour. This will also allow the different tones in the grain to show through, to also make the wood look more faded in some areas. What really helps with this technique is getting lots of contrast between the lightest and darkest parts of the grain. So I started by base coating with a mix of earth brown and black, so that it starts nice and dark. Now that it's dried, I've gone to straight earth brown to paint in all of the grain. For the most part, I just followed the texture in the sculpt, but here and there I did little coil shapes to make it look like there's knots. Now I'm doing the second layer and I've mixed some aged bone into the earth brown. This is to lighten it off. Now what I'm going to do is trace the grain that I painted in the last layer, but leave parts of it showing here and there. This is so that when the sepia wash ends up going over it, some parts will look darker than others. Then when this layer is done, I'll mix in more aged bone to lighten it off even more. With that layer, I'll trace the grain again, but I'll make sure that I don't cover up all of both the previous layers. And that will just continue layer by layer until I'm painting with straight aged bone, and I'll only be laying it down where I want the grain to look its most faded. So now I'm using the sepia wash to tint the grain a nice wooden colour. You can see the way that the parts of the grain that are lighter show through more than the darker parts. This variation helps to look more natural. I'm also using my red wash in little spots here and there just to get some variation in the wood tones. And now I'm starting to work on what I think is the other main feature of the witch besides her robe, and that's the lantern. I wanted to paint it to look as though it's lit, and then I'll do some OSL to make it look like the light from the lantern is casting onto the staff. So I'm starting by painting the windows of the lantern white. This is just so that the colours I use have a lighter base coat to go over rather than the black. Now with a lantern like this, the flame is going to be at the bottom, so the amount of light coming out the bottom is going to be more than the top. And when a flame gets cooler, it changes from yellow to red. So what we're going to end up with is a blend from red up the top to a bright yellow, almost white, right down the bottom. So I'm painting over the white with Carnage Red. This is a solid red that's got some brightness to it so it will be seen, but also dark enough that there will be a strong contrast between the light from the top and bottom of the lantern. And now we're going straight onto the orange. This is going to be the transition colour between the red and the yellow. So you can see I'm fully painting it from the bottom up, but I'm stopping short of the top so that some of the red can be seen. And at the top of the orange, I don't leave a solid line. I'm painting a few vertical lines at different lengths to blend that transition in a bit and also make it look like there's flames. And now this is where we really start to get the effect of the lantern glowing. I'm using candlelight yellow, and this is a very saturated yellow. Just like with the orange, I'm starting at the bottom, but not going as far up. Again, I painted lines of different lengths at the top to give the effect of flames, and so that there isn't just a solid line between the yellow and the orange. And then just to really push the contrast, I've mixed a little white into the yellow. As you can see though, this is only going at the very bottom. I've left most of the yellow from the previous layer showing. Now the reason I added this layer is because when doing the OSL, so the light being cast onto other objects, the brightest part of the OSL shouldn't be as bright as the brightest part of the actual light source, if that makes sense. So when I do the OSL, the brightest I'll go is yellow, which will make the light from the lantern look brighter because it's got this extra bright bit right at the bottom. Now this layer of black is just to clean up the edges of the windows so that I have neater lines to work with when painting the metal part of the lantern itself. Alright, so now we're getting onto the OSL, and this is what sells the look that the lantern is actually giving off light. There's three basic things that I think you need to do to get the look right. The first is to use very thin down paint. This allows whatever is underneath each layer, like wood grain for example, to still show through. The second is to build the layers up using the same colours as the actual light source. And the third is to make sure that you let some of each layer be seen so that the light looks more intense on surfaces that are closer to the light source. So for the first layer I used Carnage Red, and with it thinned down I painted it anywhere that I thought would get any amount of light. So I extended it as far up and down the staff and around the staff towards the back as I wanted any light to reach. And now for this second layer, I've mixed in some explosion orange, and all I'm doing, with it thinned down, is painting the exact same areas as the straight red, but just reducing it slightly in every direction. So I haven't gone as far up or down or around the back. And then to make sure the blends are smooth, I feathered out the edges, and this process will continue. So for this layer, I've dropped out the red, and I'm now using straight orange. But again, I reduce the surface area in all directions towards where I want the light to be its most intense, and then feather out the edges. This will keep going until I've worked in enough yellow for just the area that I want to look the brightest. Alright, so just as I finished the last few details for the base, the witch is done. I knew before painting her that I was going to enjoy it because she has a really cool stance and the glow from her lantern would add some atmosphere, but she might have actually ended up being my favourite mini that I've ever painted. All the different elements just really came together well, and I'm super happy with how she looks. I really hope you've enjoyed watching me paint her, and as always, I really hope there's something in here that you can take away and use in your own painting. There will definitely be more Oathsworn to come, but until next time, this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas, signing off. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.